and the meeting was advertised in the Hunterdon County Democrat and Courier News. Formal action may be taken. Can everyone stand for the flag salute?
United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So tonight's a special meeting where we do reorganization of the board. So we have two new board members here, as well as a few that were reelected. The election results have been posted on our agenda. So I would like to just read the results of that. For the 3-year term, we had 3 openings. Andrew Saunders was elected, as well as Eric Zwirling and Anna Shin. And then we have a unique 1-year term due to a resignation of a board member that is being filled and was elected Jared Beatrice. So I would like for those people mentioned to please stand and go into your packets and pull out your oath of office. And we will conduct that right now. I do need everyone to stand.
Okay.
And repeat after me. I state your name.
I, Jared Shin,
Do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution
that I will support the Constitution
of the United States
of the United States
and the Constitution
and the Constitution
of the State of New Jersey,
of the State of New Jersey,
and that I will bear true faith
and that I will bear true faith
and allegiance to the same
and allegiance to the same
and to the governments established
and to the governments established
in the United States
in the United States
and this state
and this state
under the authority of the people,
under the authority of the people,
so help me God.
so help me God.
I state your name.
I, Anna Shin,
Do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I possess the qualifications
that I possess the qualifications
prescribed by law
prescribed by law
for the office of member
for the office of member
of Board of Education.
of a Board of Education.
Have never been convicted of a crime
Have never been convicted of a crime
or offense
or offense
listed in NJSA
listed in NJSA
18A:12-1
18A:12-1
and have not been disqualified as a voter
and have not been disqualified as a voter
pursuant to RS 19:4.1,
pursuant to RS 19:4.1,
and that I will faithfully,
and that I will faithfully,
impartially,
impartially,
and justly
and justly
perform all duties of that office
perform all duties of that office
according to the best of my ability.
according to the best of my ability.
So help me God.
So help me God.
If you could please sign, and we would like to take congratulations. And if you just want to take an opportunity to take a quick photo, if you don't mind just coming up to the front.
Thank you.
So my time as acting president is almost over. We move on to the election of president. Can I, after I do roll call, Jared Beatrice.
Here.
Ray Egbert.
Here.
Carol Hampel.
Here.
Ron McKalen.
Here.
Andrew Saunders.
Here.
Thomas Wallace.
Here.
Eric Zwirling.
Here.
Anna Shin.
Here.
Laura Simon.
Here.
Moving on to the election of the president, can I get a motion and second for election?
So moved.
Second?
The way this works is you're allowed to nominate. You don't need a second for nominations. After everyone is nominated, we will vote on each person individually according to our bylaws. And the person that receives the majority of those present, 5 in this case, would become president and take over the meeting. Can I have a nomination for president?
I'd like to nominate Laura Simon.
Any other nominations for president? Not seeing any at this time. We'll take a roll call. Jared Beatrice?
Here.
Ray Egbert?
Yes.
Carol Hample?
Yes.
Robin McCallum?
Yes.
Andrew Saunders?
Yes.
Thomas Wallace?
Yes.
Eric Zwirling?
Absolutely.
Anna Shin?
Yes.
Laura Simon? Congratulations.
I'll just take it.
That's perfectly fine.
Now we will open up for the election of vice president. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Are there any nominations for vice president?
Yes, I'd like to nominate Anna Shin, please.
We have a nomination of Anna Shin. Are there any other nominations? Not hearing any, we'll close the nominations and roll call.
Jared Beatrice?
Yes.
Ray Egbert?
Yes.
Carol Hample?
Yes.
Robin McCallum?
Yes.
Andrew Saunders?
Yes.
Thomas Wallace?
Yes.
Eric Zwirling?
Absolutely.
Anna Shin?
Yes.
Laura Simon?
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Moving into the agenda for the reorganization, we need to adopt R1 through R5. Can I get a motion, please?
So moved.
Second?
Are there any questions? I have some comments on R2. But are there any questions on the items that you need clarification? Regarding R2, the way we normally handle this, these are the either committees or delegates that we participate in. And if you could email me, preferably by next week, so we can formulate the committees. We try to, consider your wishes on where you would like to be placed. Everybody has their strengths. So if you have an education background and you wish to be on ed tech, I will, try to honor that. We can't have any more than 4 board members on a committee because then we create a quorum. So just keep that in mind. So if you could let me know by the end of next week, that would be great. And
Actually, can I make a comment?
sorry again.
Can I make a comment real quick?
Yeah.
We had scheduled a finance committee meeting on Tuesday, the 8th. So I don't know if we need to
And
know
we can bump
sooner.
it up to where we're on Friday, Monday. Can we do Monday? And just make sure you're available for finance at 8:30. Is it 8:30 on Tuesday?
8:30 on Tuesday, yes.
Does that work?
Mhm.
So by Monday. Monday morning would be good.
So I guess it means you're going to be on finance.
Yes.
I'm just saying that a meeting was scheduled.
Not hearing anything, any other comments or questions? Can I get a roll call, please?
Jared Beatrice?
Yes.
Ray Egbert?
Yes.
Carol Hample?
Yes.
Robin McCallum?
Yes.
Andrew Saunders?
Yes.
Thomas Wallace?
Yes.
Eric Zwirling?
Yes.
Anna Shin?
Yes.
Laura Simon?
Yes.
Passes.
Superintendent's report?
Thank you, Mr. Simon. Happy New Year to everyone and welcome to our new board members. This evening, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Vic Lapira from Fogarty and Hara. He's going to do a presentation for us on the school code of ethics. So I'll hand it over to Mr. Lapira to begin his presentation.
Thank you very much. It's been a while since I've been down here, but it was always good to come down here. I did get to see a fox driving on my way down. Nice. I have the envious task of presenting the very interesting New Jersey School Ethics Act this evening. So I will try to make it as interesting as possible. But insofar as the School Ethics Act is concerned, from a broad perspective, especially for those who are new board members, the ones who are existing know quite a bit about it, probably. But it was passed, if I recall correctly, 25 to 30 years ago or so, just to make sure that the public had confidence in the board members, the elected members, to ensure that they were acting in ethical ways at all times. So not engaging in any self-dealing, not engaging in any manner that would undermine the public interest, and make people think that a board member was there to get favors for their friends or their family or things like that. So the School Ethics Act is comprised principally of two major components. The first is an act that sets forth a whole host of prohibited acts, and the second is the Code of Ethics for school board members. So what I'll do is we'll run through, the first thing will be the prohibited acts. So I'm not going to necessarily read these 100% verbatim, but we'll go through each one because they are important. So the first one, 24A, having an interest in a business organization or engaging in any business, transaction, or professional activity which is in substantial conflict with the proper discharge of the duties of the position of a board member. So what is an example of something like that? So for example, if a newly elected board member, for example, this is an example that came up in an advisory opinion years ago, if they had a contract with the district to provide consulting services of some nature, or they didn't, even if it was a contract with, not necessarily the district, but if they provided consulting services to students in the district, and whether it was volunteer or whether it was for pay, and they provided various consulting services, how to get into college or whatever the case may be, that is something that the public could view as potentially being a situation in which the board member appears to be using his or her position as a board member to get a financial advantage or some type of personal advantage. So that type of thing, the School Ethics Commission, which is a branch of the Department of Education, has issued an advisory opinion that indicates that that would be in violation of the School Ethics Act. So just to back up slightly, so we have the School Ethics Commission. There's a number of members who sit on it. It's part of the New Jersey Department of Education. If there is an issue and we're not sure whether or not a certain action can be taken or not be taken, so for example, volunteering, being a member of the PTA or being the head of the PTA while being on the board, various things like that, board members are permitted to ask for an advisory opinion from the School Ethics Commission, and they will issue a written opinion after one of their meetings, and it'll indicate whether you can or cannot engage in a certain transaction or engage in certain activities. There are also decisions by the commission when someone files a complaint alleging a violation of the School Ethics Act by a board member or by an administrator. Technically, it applies to administrators as well. So there are also decisions that give us guidance in that area as well. But most of the guidance that we get is typically through advisory opinions. And they release a number that they make public every year. There are others that aren't ever made public, but are just sent to the individual board member who asked the question. So those are examples. Another example that might be in conflict with the proper discharge of your duties. So for example, there have been cases where a police officer gets elected to the Board of Education. The police officer may or may not be assigned to be the school resource officer. That would be a problem because then they are engaged in daily contact with administrators, daily contact with students. Even though they might be an employee of the municipality, they're almost like an employee of the board. And then in that situation, that'd be too entangling, if you will, going beyond the role of a board member. So that's the type of thing where you would have regular daily interaction with the school and the personnel. That could be a situation that would violate that. So that's the first one. 24B, that one I think is more apparent, but using a board member's official position to secure an unwarranted privilege, advantage, or employment for the board member, members of the board member's family, or others. So that one comes up a lot. Again, the critical piece there is an unwarranted privilege. It's not necessarily that if a board member perhaps had a relative, if that's possible, that doesn't violate the nepotism policies that you have, or a friend who obtained employment or some type of an award, as a student or whatever. That in and of itself is not problematic if it's an unwarranted privilege. If, in other words, if but for the board member's involvement, or but for the fact that the board member is a board member, the student or the individual would not have received that benefit, that would be a violation. To make sure that there isn't the perception that that's happening, we always caution board members to either recuse themselves or to otherwise insulate themselves whenever a situation like that comes up. And we'll get into that when we go over like some do's and don'ts for board members. So that's that second one. So C, they have it as one prohibited act, but it's really a combination of two things. So first is, if you're acting in your official capacity where the board member or a member of your immediate family or a business organization in which the board member has an interest, has a direct or indirect financial involvement that might reasonably be expected to impair the board member's objectivity or independence of judgment. So that's the first part. So if you had a contract with the board to provide various services, it might be selling supplies to the board. You're a local business owner and the board buys from you and then you get elected to the board. There was one example where someone had a sign making business and the board would often, not frequently, but often order signs from that sign making business. So in those scenarios, the public might perceive that there's some type of inappropriate relationship, that the board member is only getting the contract for his or her business because they're on the board. So those are the types of things that are prohibited to make sure the public doesn't lose faith in the reasons why the board member is on the board. That doesn't apply to every situation where someone's company might have a contract with the board. So for example, it depends upon the nature and degree of the involvement. If the board has a contract with Pearson for whatever reason, and I'm an individual who's on the board and I happen to work for Pearson, but I don't get any commissions, I'm not involved in sales, I'm not part of the ownership of Pearson, I happen to work there in some other capacity, maybe as an editor or whatever the case may be. That's not going to be a prohibited act. Should you still recuse yourself? Probably when that contract comes up to vote on it? Yes, it probably should, but in and of itself, it wouldn't be a problem, as opposed to if you were a principal in the company or you owned the company, and then there was a vote or discussion to be had about whether the board should continue its relationship with that company, that would be inappropriate for the board member to participate in the discussion or participate in voting on that type of contract. So that's the first part of C. The second part is that a board member can't act in an official capacity in any manner in which the member or immediate family member has a personal involvement that is or creates some benefit to the member or the immediate family member. So that's a little bit different. The first part talks about whether it might impair the board member's objectivity or independence of judgment. And it talks about financial interest. This is if you have a personal interest that might create some benefit to you or the immediate family member. So if there was a scenario in which you might be voting on something that might have to do with your child who's a student in the district, or there might be some personal involvement, even if there's no financial involvement, if there might be some type of personal benefit if you vote on a matter to a family member, immediate family member, such as like a spouse or a child, that could be a situation where that would come up too. So we probably see in the various advisory opinions, this is the one that comes up most frequently. There are often questions about that. So those come up quite frequently. So those are important to know. In terms of the other ones, in terms of the prohibitions, undertaking any employment or service, whether compensated or not, which might reasonably be expected to prejudice the board member's independence of judgment in the exercise of official duties. There was one example where I don't know if it was a retired teacher or if it was someone who was on the board, but they provided a writing skills course and consulting service to students. And again, much like A, there's a little bit of overlap there. The thought process was by the School Ethics Commission is that, well, it might seem like you are, that you're getting that financial benefit from being on the board, and then you're offering these services, or it might affect your independence of judgment if the board is voting on curriculum, for example, and you're a board member and you're voting on curriculum. There might be one that you prefer to another because it might make your business a little bit easier or harder, or things like that. So those are things that that board members need to be aware of if they have any type of employment or service that would potentially prejudice the board member or affect their independence of judgment in the exercise of their official duties when they're voting on anything here before the board. E is very long-winded, but it's pretty simple. Let me distill it for you. Basically, don't take bribes. But that's effectively what it is. If you either solicit or accept, and that's either whether it's you directly or whether it's through a family member or some kind of business organization, any gift, any favor, loan, political contribution, service, promise of future employment, or other thing of value, so pretty broad, based on an understanding that it was offered for the purpose of influencing you directly or indirectly in your role as a board member. So, that's something. So, for example, political contributions is the one that's a little bit complicated, but the law is clear there that it doesn't apply to solicitation or acceptance of contributions to a campaign of a candidate who's running for public office, so long as there's no knowledge to believe that it's not a quid pro quo, right? Like, I'll give you this campaign donation if you agree to support this initiative, or if you agree that you'll vote in favor of this contract, or whatever the case may be. So that would be something that is prohibited. But from a general standpoint, it's just basically do not accept or solicit any kind of a gift or anything of value, whether it's a favor that someone's going to do for you or whatever the case may be, in exchange for your vote on something. So pretty straightforward. Frankly, I do not see that one come up almost ever. I don't know. I mean, because first of all, you don't really need an advisory opinion on that. It's pretty straightforward if you're doing it or you're not. And second, I think most people just don't do that. So a few more here. F talks about if you use or allow your public office to be used, or any information that's not generally available to the public that you get through being a board member for the purpose of securing financial gain for the board member or any immediate family member or business organization in which you are engaged. So what would that be exactly? If you had information confidentially about the board doing something, I don't know. I mean, to give it an example, what if the board was interested in potentially buying property or something of that nature? You couldn't use that information to tell your family member, hey, go buy this piece of property before the board gets it, because then if you get it, you can hold out and the board will pay more money for it. I mean, that obviously would be prohibited. It's self-dealing and things like that. And again, many of them are very similar, right, to A, and which talks about the financial interests. So a lot of them are to prohibit either self-dealing or to prohibit a situation where members of the public might think this board member is not acting in the public interest; they're acting in their own interest. So that's what drives most of these prohibited acts. For some reason, there was a question that came up, an advisory opinion about a board member who was a freelance writer for the local press and said, can I still do this? If I have to report on Board of Ed activities or whatever. Essentially what the School Ethics Commission said is you can still do it, but you should probably refrain from reporting on the Board of Ed, period. And to the extent that you do refrain from the Board of Ed, you need to keep in mind that if you have confidential information that you acquire through being a board member, you can't use that information when you're conducting, writing one of your articles or whatever. So the general advice there was to refrain from even covering the Board of Ed, have someone else cover that. G talks about representing a person or a party other than the school board in connection with any cause, any proceeding or application or matter pending before the district, or in any proceeding involving the school district. So what would that mean? So for example, if you were potentially representing a student in a case that involved the board, I mean, this to me probably applies more to lawyers, but could also apply to advocates. I mean, if you were advocating on behalf of a student, maybe a special education student, and your interests were adverse to the board, that would be a problem, right? That's pretty self-explanatory. So those are the types of things that are prohibited, and that kind of rounds out the various prohibitions. Now, what does the School Ethics Act permit? A couple of things, but these are H, I, and J are technically within the prohibited acts section, but they basically are using these sections to say, okay, but these are things that are all right. These are things that are not prohibited. So if you participate in any matter that you're required to vote on, and there's no material or monetary gain that you are going to receive as a board member, and as a member of any business or profession or occupation or group that you're involved with, that could otherwise be reasonably expected to accrue to any other member of that group, that's okay. So I kind of go back to that example that would involve, like if you worked for Pearson or the district had a contract with Pearson. If you're acting in some capacity, but you're not going to gain any benefit from that, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. You're not prohibited from making an inquiry for information on behalf of a constituent, so long as there's no fee or reward or other thing of value, basically no gift that's given in return for you inquiring, with the superintendent or the business administrator about some potential action. That's fine. And then finally, what was also permitted is representing either the board member or an immediate family member in negotiations or proceedings concerning the board member or immediate family member's interests. So that type of situation is permitted. A classic example of that would be, and this used to be a problem way back when, but then the School Ethics Act changed with regard to this. If you have a student in the district who's classified special education student, and this doesn't happen very often, thankfully, but if you had a dispute with the way the district was providing that student's program, the various options that exist are you can file a request for due process. It can be heard by a hearing officer to determine whether or not the district must offer something different or if what they're offering is appropriate. There's a conflict there necessarily, right? Because it's the board member is advocating on behalf of his or her child, and it's necessarily adverse to the district, but that's an example of a right that you do not give up as a board member, right? That's a right that you're guaranteed by federal law. If you have a dispute with the local school district about your child's education, you can file a request for due process. So by becoming a board member, you don't give that up. So that's a possibility there. Again, these hardly ever come up, but it's good to know what they are. So turning now to the Code of Ethics for school board members. So this is basically, you'll see oftentimes that this is written down on one big sheet. Sometimes the New Jersey School Boards Association will provide that to board members or in various contexts. So let's just go through these. These are the things that as a board member you've agreed that you're going to do now that you've been elected to the board. So the first one, pretty straightforward, but I will uphold and enforce all laws, rules, and regulations of the State Board of Education and court orders pertaining to schools. Desired changes shall be brought about only through legal and ethical procedures. Okay, straightforward. So we're not going to do anything underhanded. We're not going to say, oh, the state board says this is the way we have to do our budget calculations, or the state board says this is the way that we have to purchase materials consistent with the public school contracts law, but I'm just going to ignore that. I'm going to do it differently. That can't be done, obviously. So that's the first thing, is basically abide by the law. And as a lawyer, we like that, right? So that certainly needs to be done. B, I will make decisions in terms of the educational welfare of the children and will seek to develop and maintain public schools that meet the individual needs of all children, regardless of their ability, race, creed, sex, or social standing. So to paraphrase that, we're making our decisions with the interests of the children as paramount, and we're not going to be discriminatory in any way when we're making decisions about how the school district is going to be run. We're certainly going to make sure that it's inclusive, that it's non-discriminatory, and that the children's interests or best interests are always primary when making a decision. C is, and this is C and D really are what I would call big ones, in the sense of these are the ones that we sometimes see when we see either complaints, ethics complaints that are made against board members, or just even if it doesn't rise to the level, but there are potential issues. These are the ones that I see most often from almost always well-intentioned board members. But so C is I will confine my board action to policy-making, planning, and appraisal. And I will help to frame policies and plans only after the board has consulted those who will be affected by them. And then I want to read that in conjunction with D, which is I will carry out my responsibility not to administer the schools, but together with my fellow board members to see that they are well run. So that gets to the heart, really, I think, of your role as board members being elected to this position. You may find, and some of you who have been on the board for quite some time and others who are new, you may find that your constituents or neighbors may think that you can just go do something, right? I mean, they complain about, well, why is it a drop off like this, or whatever the case may be. They complain with the soccer field or wherever it is, and they want you to go do something. But the administration, the day-to-day administration of the school, or they may have complained about a teacher and say, I think this teacher should be fired, or whatever the case may be that happens, right? The day-to-day administration of the school is really done by your administration, right? So your superintendent is your educational leader, and he is going to be involved in the day-to-day operation of the school. He is the person who makes recommendations about hiring staff, terminating staff, so forth and so on. That's something that I think a lot of people who are not board members misunderstand about the role of the board. The board will approve the hiring of many people, but the only hiring that you as a board do in terms of like interviewing and making a decision is your superintendent. Everybody else, your superintendent does all of the groundwork, does the interviews, does everything else, and then makes a recommendation to you as to who you should hire. And you can either accept that recommendation or not accept it, but in the end, the superintendent is really the person who's doing that. And obviously the business administrator is making recommendations about how the district is going to operate in terms of financial aspect, and the board obviously approves all of those things, but the day-to-day operation is done by the administration. So if you imagine, it's really not that different in the sense, if you have a CEO of a company and a CFO of a company, and you have a board of directors, the board of directors doesn't get involved on a daily basis to figure out, how the product should be marketed or how it should be sold or whatever the case may be. Here, same thing. Your CEO is your superintendent, your business administrator is your CFO, and you kind of sit as the board of directors, and you want to make sure that the policies are set forth. I mean, you might be involved in strategic planning, a 5-year plan as to what we're going to do with the district, where we're going to move forward, looking at enrollment, things of that nature, curriculum. Again, a lot of those things will come from recommendations from your administration, but the board as a whole is a policy-making and planning body. And then once you as a board set the policies, then it's up to the administration to implement them, right? The administration, and then of course, your staff as well. So that's what we sometimes you might hear that there's been ethics complaints filed against board members, not here, but other places, and they accuse board members of micromanaging, right? That's kind of like the classic issue that is covered by these two items in the code of ethics. So that's an important thing to remember. E, I recognize that authority rests with the Board of Education, will make no personal promises nor take any private action that may compromise the board. Okay, so that's important too. Board members may disagree about a specific course of action that is taken, and that's okay, and that's fine. You can have a healthy debate about it. You're going to vote on whatever it may be. Maybe it's a policy that has to do with, not necessarily applicable here for K-8, but maybe varsity letters, right? That was a big thing that came out last year, 2 years ago. Should you get them not only for athletics, but also for non-athletic competition? If you're in the robotics club or if you're in something else. You would think that a lot of school districts probably would say, yeah, that's a substantial time investment. Sure, we should award those. But then there are other people who feel very strongly that varsity letter and that jacket is for athletics only. So that's a policy. That's a determination that the board can make as to whether they want to award something like that. So you can have those discussions, but once it's voted upon, you basically need to say, okay, this is the way it goes. I didn't necessarily want it to go that way, but now I'm going to support that. I'm not going to take any private action that might somehow compromise the board. I'm not going to work against it privately or anything like that. Those are things that might be in violation of the code of ethics. Another area in which we see private action that might compromise the board, where it comes up or at least the analysis of that comes up pretty frequently, is letters to the editor, where sometimes people might write a letter to the editor. They might not disclose that they're a board member, or it might be known that they're a board member, but that's not really clear. Are they speaking on behalf of the board? Are they not speaking on behalf of the board? Maybe if a statement is made in such a way, it might lead to litigation that might put the board at risk. So those are areas in which board members need to be careful about the public statements they make. That doesn't mean that individual board members can't have individual opinions about, things that come before the board, but we just need to be careful that when we're speaking, mostly when there's a letter to the editor or maybe a Facebook post or something like that, as to who is saying that. Is it the board as a whole who's saying it? Am I authorized to speak on behalf of the board? Or is this just my personal opinion? Right. So those are the things that are covered by that item in the Code of Ethics. F, the next one, I refuse to surrender my independent judgment to special interest or partisan political groups, or to use the schools for personal gain or for the gain of friends. Okay. That's pretty straightforward. That's covered up by the prohibited acts in large fashion. And they talk about special interest or partisan political groups. Obviously, the Board of Education elections are nonpartisan by design. That doesn't mean that people can't have party affiliations, but they're not on the ballot, and so forth and so on. So that's an important piece, which hopefully distinguishes Board of Education membership from other types of political membership. At least that's what I found in my experience. But are there some boards that are necessarily political? Sure, but for the most part, I find that not as many. It's not quite like municipalities. So G is, I will hold confidential all matters pertaining to the schools, which, if disclosed, would needlessly injure individuals or the schools and all other matters. I will provide accurate information and, in concert with my fellow board members, interpret to the staff the aspirations of the community for the school. So to unpack that a little bit, two pieces. Number one is, and for the board members who are new, the board does most of its work out here in public session, right? But there are times in which you will go into what's often referred to as either closed session or executive session. The Open Public Meetings Act specifies, I think it's 12, situations in which you can go or you need to go into closed executive session to have certain discussions. What are those types of things? Those might be discussions about negotiations, whether it's with your teachers union. It could be negotiations if you have negotiations with an outside company because you're purchasing a product or whatever the case may be, and it's not something that is publicly bid, so there's actually negotiations there. Those types of issues need to be dealt with in closed session. Safety and security issues. There are times when there might be information about the board's safety procedures and security mechanisms that, if disclosed or if discussed in public session, would potentially threaten the safety and security of your school. So that's another reason why you can discuss things in executive session, matters that are within the attorney-client privilege, if there are matters such as that. And there's a variety of other matters that can be discussed in closed session. So what that kind of means is it's not quite, like what goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas, but when you're discussing things in closed session, you need to be mindful of the fact that you're in closed session for a reason. That information that you learn there in closed session should not ever go out into the community. There may be a time and place in which discussions that take place in closed session may be revealed to the community, but that's not a determination that individual board members make. That's something that is made by the board, if and when appropriate. So that's something that I don't think happens a lot, but I will say that in my experience over the last, 16, 17 years, going to various board meetings, representing a variety of boards, what we do see sometimes, and it's not necessarily new board members, it could be board members who have been on the board for quite some time, you have to be careful and judicious about the information that you have. It's tempting. Sometimes people come up to you and they want to ask you questions and they have a total misunderstanding about something. They think that something that's going on in the district is totally wrong, totally inappropriate, but they don't have the facts right. And there are times when you can correct them and give them the correct facts, but there are other times, especially with personnel issues, when You know that there is a different situation, but you can't say anything about it. And that's frustrating because it's confidential information. So, leaking, if you will, that confidential information would be inappropriate. So that's what this code of ethics provision talks about. And also in the second part of it, providing accurate information. And I like the way that this is kind of written because, again, I think it kind of talks about what the goal of the board members are. So in concert with my fellow board members, interpret to the staff the aspirations of the community for its school. So you are all here because your constituents have determined that you should serve on the Board of Education, and there are interests and aspirations that the community has. So, and that's what you will all be working towards, to make sure that the education that you can provide to the kids in this town is as good as possible. But also, you want to make sure that it's not super expensive. So that's the challenge that you all have, is satisfying the taxpayers in multiple ways. So that's the role of the board member, to make sure that your planning and policy making is done in such a way where you're going to best meet the needs of those students and of the community in general. So, but keeping matters confidential is important. If there's ever a question, ask your superintendent and business administrator if you ever have a question as to whether or not something can or cannot be disclosed. It probably is obvious, but when in doubt, just ask the question first. H is, I will vote to appoint the best qualified personnel available after consideration of the recommendation of the chief administrative officer. So that goes back to the statute, which is 18A 27-4.1, says that a Board of Education may only hire staff based upon the recommendation of the superintendent of schools. So, that's important when we talk about the code of ethics. There are, separate from the code of ethics, there's also a nepotism policy or bylaw that the board has that would prohibit, with limited exceptions, the hiring of relatives of board members. And that definition of relative is fairly expansive. It covers a lot of individuals. But that's important because the key is to make sure that we're hiring the best qualified personnel, right? And not that we're hiring people who we're friends with or whatever the case might be. Again, I don't have any reason to believe that would ever happen, but that's part of the code of ethics for school board members. And the reason that it exists is because way back when, there were people who were doing exactly that. So that's the important piece there. And just rounding it out, the last two, I will support and protect school personnel in the proper performance of their duties. So that's kind of the consideration with some of the other things that we've discussed before, but to make sure that once we decide on a certain action, we're going to support school personnel as they fulfill that view or fulfill those policies. And the last one, and this is important too, because this will certainly happen to you as board members. For those of you who are board members, it's probably happened already, but and I use the soccer field as an example because that's where it happens almost all the time, or a baseball field, or whatever the case might be. You might be in the supermarket and someone comes to you and says, I have a complaint about this, and I have an issue with this teacher. I have such and such. Resist the urge, even though I know that you all want to help and make things right, resist the urge to handle it on your own because you're not permitted to do that. Refer it to the superintendent. Any complaints that you get, you refer to the superintendent. And you would act on those complaints at public meetings only if the superintendent or business administrator, whomever is involved at the administrative level, hasn't addressed it. And that's because, again, the superintendent and your staff are going to be administering the schools. If there's a complaint, it should follow the proper chain of command. And it should be dealt with at the lowest possible level first, not by board members, because that's technically the highest possible level. Okay, avoiding common potential pitfalls. These are things that we do see from time to time. So I kind of stole my own thunder there because that's the first one, is always refer complaints to the superintendent. Again, so that one we've basically discussed. And it's only after there's been no action, which hopefully will never happen, but that's the only time when you should really be bringing it up at a public board meeting. The second one, again, we've kind of talked about this as well, that it's really to help frame policies and plans only after the board is consulted with those who will be affected by them. So that, and that's something that latter part is something that I think isn't given a lot of I shouldn't say a lot of consideration, but doesn't see a lot of discussion. But, there is, the role of the board is to make sure that it is framing the policies and plans appropriately, but there should be some level of discussion or at least outreach to the community. That may happen through your superintendent and business administrator, but it may happen through public forums. You're passing a policy. I mean, when you pass policies, you need 2 readings, right? So if you have participants who come to the board meetings, or they can otherwise, get the information about them in some other way, you have a reading of the policy. If people have questions about it or they have comments, they can come up here and comment, say, I don't think you should pass that policy. I think it should be differently, whatever it is. But the goal is to consult with those who will be affected by those policies to make sure that, we're not doing it without thinking about those individuals. I think this last one is probably pretty self-explanatory, but avoid giving orders to staff members. Really doesn't happen very often, but it could happen if you put yourself in certain situations. And one of the things we'll talk about a little bit later is volunteering in the district. That's where it could happen, right? If you're volunteering to help out with something in the district, and then staff members kind of start taking direction from you, that would be in violation of the School Ethics Act. So staff and administrators need to direct the staff. You need to be evaluating the administrators and their direction of the staff. Refrain from referring friends to the superintendent for employment. Again, it's getting an unwarranted employment benefit or unwarranted advantage that is prohibited. But what we generally believe is don't even get to the point where someone's going to question that. You don't want someone to say that you were using the schools for personal gain or for the gain of your friends or whatever the case may be. If there's an opening, you can certainly tell your friends or whomever that there's an opening. They can apply. And it's the superintendent's job, or depending on what level it is, you'll eventually rise to the superintendent. It might be the principals who are doing interviews, but they're going to make that decision as to who's the best qualified candidate. And that's where people get into trouble, is if they're trying to have someone other than the best qualified candidate get the job. And so that could be a problem. And finally, if you have issues with board policies or procedures or curriculum, et cetera, refer it to the superintendent. The superintendent will discuss it with his staff. If there's going to be changes, the superintendent will make recommendations to the full board. But as they say there, direct contact with non-central office staff could be viewed as going beyond the policymaking and planning, right? So that gets into the micromanaging aspect. So that's something that we recommend that you avoid. And then let me see where we are in terms of time. Okay, so the advisory opinions. So we mentioned before that there are advisory opinions that are issued. That's one of the School Ethics Commission's primary functions. Any school official can ask about their own personal conduct or proposed activity if you have that issue. I mean, typically, if that does come up, or if you have a question, you certainly ask the superintendent. Usually it goes through us first. We might have the answer right away because there's a decision right on it, or there's advisory opinion that is dispositive of that. But if that's not the case, and that this happens from time to time, we give an answer and we say, it's probably prohibited, but if you want to ask the School Ethics Commission, you can do so. And I say that because the School Ethics Commission was issuing decisions for many years, and then for a couple of years they didn't issue any publicly because they didn't have enough members to vote to make them public. And then in, I think it was 15 or 16, they issued like 20 or 30 of them all in a row, and that kind of upended a lot of things that we thought, right? We thought this was not prohibited. Oh, now it is. Or we thought this was prohibited. Oh, now it's not. So the School Ethics Commission sometimes changes its mind. So our advice is only as good as the most recent information we have from them. So you can request an advisory opinion. It is technically possible to request an advisory opinion about conduct of another board member, but that's rare, and you have to give that other board member notice, and there's a whole host of issues with regard to that. So mostly it's if you have a question yourself. And then what we typically do is if you have a question and want an advisory opinion, we typically write to the School Ethics Commission on your behalf. We usually hear back pretty promptly. They released some of those to the public. In 2018, they released, I think 5, but 3 of them were really of interest. The other 2 were kind of pretty self-explanatory, things that had already been discussed before. So the 3 that we really talk about here, advisory opinion A15-18. So that was the 15th one they decided in 2018. I don't think they did 20 or 30. So this was a situation where the board member was very active in the community. The board member was the president of the PTA. He or she, I don't remember if it was a he or she, I think it was she, but I'm not 100% sure, was a homeroom parent, was a parent coordinator, coordinated the family movie night in the district, coordinated field day, a lot of things. So a lot of volunteer service there, which is very nice. We need people like that, but was very involved. And was also an active supporter of the local education association during contract negotiations and supported them, but wasn't formally endorsed by the association. So the question that came up was whether or not the board member could serve in those various positions, number one, and number two, could they be involved in negotiations? Because one of the cases that has come out has said that if you are endorsed by the association, by the local education association, you're not in a position to then be negotiating across the table with them as a board member, because the public would believe that you don't necessarily have the Board of Education's best interests in mind, but that you might be more closely aligned with the Education Association. Not that anyone's bad or good, but it's a situation where you need to have the appropriate level of separation there. So in this particular case, they said that volunteering in and of itself is not prohibited, right? There were cases or advisory opinions that were issued several years ago that discouraged or said that it would be a violation of the School Ethics Act if you volunteered in certain capacities. And then what happened was, I think a lot of people thought, well, that means I can't volunteer. No, that's not the case. It depends on the level of volunteering. So if you were volunteering as a coach, that's a problem, because the coach is often going to be evaluated by or take direction from individuals who you, as board members, are technically the boss of, right? So that blurs the lines and it makes it a little bit complicated. Excessive involvement with students on a day-to-day basis as a coach. So that would be inappropriate. Now, here they said, no, these positions are fine. They basically said that being the PTA president is basically passive, right? You're not directly interacting with students on a daily basis or with staff on a daily basis, so that's not problematic. The same thing with being the homeroom coordinator or the homeroom parent. Yes, there are some interactions with staff and with students, but those are infrequent. So those were not prohibited. But the important piece is, if you're volunteering in the school district, it's the degree of involvement that you have with staff and students, and the degree to which you might be interpreted as either giving or receiving orders from staff. So there have been other cases, for example, that came out where a board member wanted to volunteer to be a volunteer with the play, right? School play. In one case, they said, well, no, you can't really be the director of the play because it's too much involvement. You're directing students and staff constantly. There was another one where the person basically was, for lack of a better word, I mean, he was the carpenter who made the sets, right? And he was helping out, I don't know if it was his wife or whomever else it was that was involved with the play direction. So they said, no, the latter part is okay, right? Just putting together the sets and minimal interaction with staff and students, not a problem. But if you're involved in basically if you're like an employee or someone who would otherwise receive a stipended position, that definitely would be a problem. So it's the level of involvement. So here there was no conflict. And then they also said no conflict with regard to negotiations because the person wasn't specifically endorsed by the union. Had they been specifically endorsed by the union, that would potentially be a problem. But again, they said that you need to exercise caution when you're volunteering in the district, and what you should do whenever you're volunteering in the district is let the superintendent and the relevant staff know that you are volunteering. You're there as a parent and a volunteer. You're not there as a board member. This way, they don't have the belief that I have to do something because board member X is volunteering with me. Now I have to do something differently, or whatever. We don't want that kind of feeling, right? They should be doing the right thing all the time, and they shouldn't be taking direction directly from board members. So that's basically the takeaway there. You can serve in those high-level PTA positions as long as it's passive, and that type of political activity that you might engage in, advocating for teachers prior to the election without having their endorsement, that's fine. A718 So this deals with nepotism to a degree, and also like whether or not you can be involved in either negotiations, so forth and so on. So in this particular case, the cousin of a board member's wife, so cousin-in-law, if you will, worked in the school district, was a member of the local education association and the NJEA. The cousin doesn't hold, so before I get into this whole leadership position thing, let me give you a quick background as I get to this opinion and the last one. So if you, this has gone through many iterations, but if you are a member or if you have an immediate family member who is a member of the NJEA, so forth and so on, there's restrictions on whether or not you can be involved in negotiations. So there was a case or an advisory opinion that came out a couple of years ago that did like a handy dandy little chart and analyzed all these things very detailed. So just very briefly running through it. So if a board member is a teacher in another school district, but you're a member of the union or covered by the union contract, whether it's the NJEA affiliate or if it's an American Federation of Teachers affiliate, whatever the case may be, you can't participate in negotiations, right? The concept is that if you're involved in negotiations, you might be negotiating terms and conditions for your teachers that might then be used as comparables and might affect your pay raise or your terms and conditions of employment. So they say that you can't be involved in negotiations. However, once there's a memorandum of agreement and salary guides and everything is done, you can vote on it after the total compensation package is there, unless there's some other conflict. But if that's the only conflict, then you can do that. Now, if you have an immediate family member who's in the district, so basically we're talking about a spouse or a child for the most part, if you have that, and that can happen because you might get elected and you already have someone who's employed in the district, you can't participate in any aspect of negotiations or vote on the contract, right? The theory there being, if you're voting on the contract, you're voting on your spouse's raise or your child's raise, or whatever the case may be. So that's prohibited. That's an easy one. Now, if you have an immediate family member that works in another neighboring district that's also part of the union or covered by a union, that's like the first one. You can't participate in any aspect of negotiations, but when the time comes to vote, after everything is said and done, and now it's literally just voting on the contract, you could do that as well. Again, same concept there is that it might violate the prohibited acts because the public might think that if you're involved in negotiations, you're negotiating to get a better deal for your husband or wife, even though they work in a different district, because districts often use comparability, right, between other school districts and within the county and so forth and so on. So that's an important piece there. And then finally, if you have a relative who's employed in the district, not an immediate family member, but a relative, so that could be, and that's pretty expansive. It could be anybody, including a cousin, so forth and so on. You can't participate in negotiations, including voting. Again, because if you're voting, you're giving the benefit to that person. But if you have a relative who's a member of another statewide public teachers union, you still can participate in negotiations there, so long as, and this is what this case basically held. I mean, even though this was one to a cousin-in-law who worked in the district, what it basically found was, in that situation, is that if they are part of that same union, or they're part of the statewide public teachers union, but they work in another school district, so long as they don't have some type of leadership position or on the union's bargaining team, like someone who's really important in that other union, then it's okay. So that's what happened in A718. They said, so it's not defined as a family member or immediate family member, but it does constitute, remember when we talked about the prohibited acts, you can't secure unwarranted privileges or advantages of employment for immediate family members or others. So this cousin-in-law would be an other, as they describe it. And in that scenario, you can't extend any unwarranted privileges, but what they said is a cousin is really no different from any other person. In that scenario, unless the person had some type of leadership position in the other union, then it's not going to be an issue. Now, when they talk about unwarranted privileges, because they did get into a discussion about that, what would be problematic? Well, if you were trying to secure a position for that person and they weren't the most qualified candidate, or they weren't recommended by the superintendent, so we discussed that previously, that would be trying to secure unwarranted privileges, and that would be prohibited by the act. If your wife's cousin works in the district and there's a disciplinary issue, and then you're involved in saying, "Oh, I don't think we should discipline my wife's cousin," that's a potential problem, because it might see, especially if everyone else believes discipline is justified, that's a scenario. And if there was, for example, getting a stipend for the cousin that wasn't provided to other staff members, again, prohibited. So in scenarios like that, it's best to recuse yourself, not be part of that discussion. But when the union is raising, when you're voting on a contract, you're raising salaries for all staff. There's not an unwarranted benefit for that particular person. So takeaway, it's not having a cousin or a cousin-in-law, as the case may be, is not a conflict that prevents participation in negotiations here, unless you're trying to get an unwarranted benefit. And if it's in another school district, if it's a family member or a relative, that's, if it's a brother, for example, that was one case that came up, that would be okay, so long as they don't have a leadership position. And then I think this is the last one here, A10-18. So this was a weird case. The local teachers union supported the board member's election. They offered financial support to the board member, and the board member denied it. But the NJEA issued a number of mailings that were supporting the board member's election, even though the board member basically said, "I want to have nothing to do with you," for whatever reason. Board member didn't request the mailings, didn't create the mailings. They weren't even created with the board member's knowledge. There was no promise or anything like that. So then the question was, once they were elected, would they be, well, first of all, would the endorsement be violating the School Ethics Act, and could they be participating in negotiations? So the other wrinkle that was unusual about this is that at some point in time, the union president engaged or threatened litigation against the board member, saying that the board member had made some defamatory comments during the election. So that was a weird situation, because they were supporting the board member and then they were threatening to sue him or her afterwards. But what basically they found there is that the board member never took any action that would compromise the board. A past endorsement is not going to limit it, especially when the person didn't seek out the endorsement, didn't accept money, so forth and so on. I mean, I've long wondered for many years whether or not a teachers association might try to endorse someone who was very much saying we shouldn't pay teachers anymore, right? Under the theory that we'll get them out of participating in negotiations, right? It's kind of using it as a sword instead of a shield. You can't do that. So if they were trying to do that, that's not going to work. And that's basically what this case said, is that so long as you're not providing anybody with unwarranted privileges or anything like that, then no. And with regard to the potential lawsuit from the union president, in that situation, the board member just needed to recuse himself from any public votes regarding the union in that particular situation. So you can accept endorsements from local and statewide unions without creating a per se conflict, but you just have to make sure that you're not engaging in any type of actions that might give unwarranted privileges. And then this case with in Ray Gonzalez, this was school ethics complaints that were filed. Oh, so this is an interesting case against several board members by the superintendent or former superintendent, as the case may be. The board approved the settlement agreement with the former superintendent, and it included a payment of $184,000. I wasn't involved in this. I don't know exactly what was going on, but obviously there was an issue. There was probably a termination of the contract. So the payment in this case was contingent upon the withdrawal of all the ethics complaints as well as other items. Nobody was contributing personal funds. It was all district funds, but all the board members who had the complaints against them voted to approve the agreement. And that was a problem because the thought process was that they were acting on it in a way where they had an interest in a personal benefit, right, which was getting the School Ethics Act complaints dismissed. So the theory was that would undermine the public confidence in the conduct of the school officials, so they should not have voted on it. They should have recused themselves. So what happened? each one of the four board members got suspended for 60 days. And because they needed the board to be able to operate, the School Ethics Act actually staggered the suspension. So it was board member 1 was the first 60 days, board member 2 was the next 60, and so forth and so on. So that gives you an example, however, of things that can happen. I mean, the School Ethics Act does have the ability to impose penalties. Those penalties could be a censure, a reprimand, it could even be suspension, and in really extreme cases, could be removal from the board. I think this is the last one here, free speech in the School Ethics Act. So you don't give up your rights as a citizen that you have with regard to freedom of speech when you become a board member, but you still have to comply with the School Ethics Act. So when we talked before about letters to the editor and things like that, you have to make sure that you are not compromising the board by putting the board in a position that could be potentially problematic through either a social media post or a public statement or a letter to the editor, whatever the case may be. So that's because you have to recognize that authority rests with the board, and you're not making any personal promises or taking private action. And you have to maintain confidentiality, of course, at all times, and you have to make sure that you are ensuring that any information that you put out there is accurate. So if it is accurate and not confidential, then in terms of a public statement, you still might be prohibited from putting it out there if it's going to potentially compromise the board and something that the board is doing. So be mindful of that. The letter to the editor, this was decided years ago, back in 06 and 07. What they basically said is that you can send letters to the editor, but you have to essentially provide accurate information that's not confidential. You have to you can't hold yourself out as a board member, so you have to indicate that you are a board member, but that you're writing as a private citizen. That even though I am a board member, these views are not necessarily are not authorized by or supported by the board necessarily. And so you have to make that very clear. If you make that clear, then it's not a problem. And so those were letters to the editor. This was in 06 and 07. Facebook wasn't such a big thing. Social media wasn't such a big thing. That really should be done as well when it comes to your social media posts. It doesn't come up very often, but in theory, it could be if someone thinks that your social media postings are official board statements, that could be a problem. So just keep that in mind. And then, with regard to defamation, just be mindful that although you can make public statements, they need to be accurate, they need to be appropriate. You're not going to be immune from any civil lawsuits for defamation or anything like that if something that you report out is inaccurate. So practical considerations for social media postings. Be careful about what you post up there. Keep in mind that even if all the information you put out is accurate, it can still be problematic. Even if it's lawful and doesn't violate the School Ethics Act, just be mindful that sometimes these things can become viral and they get picked up by the local media. I mean, if you Google, like I think school district board member social media or school district board member Facebook or something like that, you'll find quite a few situations where people got themselves into a lot of hot water. In some cases, we don't really mind that they got themselves into a lot of hot water because those people were obviously jerks and they put really inappropriate things on social media. So thank God they're gone. But just be mindful of that because it is something as a public official, your actions will be scrutinized probably more closely than that of other individuals. So that is the entire presentation. If anybody has any questions.
Yes, I have a couple. I've gotten Mr. Stephen Foster's opinion on this. I want to get yours as well. Let us see what.
Fogarty, yeah.
Fogarty, excuse me. Minister is Environmental Commission, excuse me. Let us see evidence that have absolutely nothing to do with the school board. Like, for instance, if it has something to do with a commentary about federal policy, whatever it happens to be. There's no reason for me to state that I'm a board member and this is not related to the board. I mean, if I'm writing a letter together about federal environmental policy.
I have to check. It might not be an issue. I think that the complicating factor is that if someone, you just don't want people to think that this is the board's position on X, right?
I mean,
Yeah.
if
They shouldn't be, right?
I mean, if nowhere in there does it sound, I think that actually saying that I'm a board member and this isn't a member, this isn't the board.
These aren't necessarily the views of the board. It's not
Really,
authorized
I
by the
think that
board.
actually it sounds as if I'm trying to tout the fact that I'm a board member. If I just say I'm a
Right.
referral, most people probably have no clue.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's not one that has come up before because typically, almost always, the ones where we get the question, it's when someone says, "I want to write a letter to the editor about this." It's absolutely about Board of Education business, or it's about the teachers union, or it's about something, right? That's clearly going to be, if not disclosing that you're a board member and that this is not necessarily the view of the board, this is your personal opinion, people might mistake it for being official Board of Education statements. So those are the ones. So with that regard, I have to check, but that might not be required. I don't know that the School Ethics Act makes a distinction, but or in the advisory opinions that they've issued, but I can easily, without spending a lot of time, I can easily check that.
Okay.
And if Steve's given an opinion, I'll check with him too.
I mean, I just want to
Yeah.
make sure that that's, consistent with current interpretations. The next thing is,
Yeah.
and this is probably not a school ethics question, but more a meeting decorum question. Let's say that we have a contentious issue where we decide to change a course offering or something like that, and we have members of the public who are very heartfelt opinions, and we have a room full of people giving their opinions.
Right.
Um,
I've been to many of those meetings.
and we are hearing what their opinions are, and they're bringing things to light that we may not have considered. They're standing there expressing their opinion. We are hearing it. We have had previous opinions by others who have said, you as a board member must sit there and remain absolutely silent and not say anything. Whereas other times, some of us have felt that it's appropriate to at least acknowledge the person, what they're saying, give them to know that we're not just sitting here and ignoring them. But also there are times that it may be reasonable for us, or at least is it reasonable for us to say that is something that we have not considered, that this is, maybe that opinion is valid, maybe we should do this, maybe we should do that. Is it appropriate for a board member to sit there silently, taking this all in, when in a public meeting, it may be more reasonable for that to have that, and say, listen, I'm not speaking for the board, but I as an individual think that what he or she just said is fairly reasonable, expressing that to the other members of the board, so the other members of the board on a timely manner understand what that person is feeling, and also the administration understand what that board member is feeling. Because otherwise, let's say that it would go back to that particular committee. You may not even be on that particular committee, whether it's the finance committee or the curriculum committee or the education committee, whatever happens to be. You may not even be on that committee to express that in closed doors.
Mhm.
So it's a function really of decorum, and I don't think ethics, but I think that it's something that should be discussed, now, and also in the fact that we have a new superintendent as well.
So in answer to that question, so I guess I would, even though it requires an explanation, I would say in general, yeah, it's not prohibited from making any comments, but this is the perspective that I would bring going to a lot of different board meetings in different districts and those board meetings that we talk about where they might be contentious or there's a lot of public. I've been to a lot of those. Sometimes they're good meetings and sometimes you wish you were somewhere else, right? But that's just the nature of public service. So what I think is probably the best way to address those things is two ways. Number one, and often when you have a board meeting and there's not a lot of people present, and it's a relatively small board meeting, there's a natural inclination if someone comes up and says, well, I have a question about this, right, to engage in that back and forth. Again, it's not prohibited, but when you have 30 people who are engaged in that back and forth, you're going to be here till midnight or later. And I've been to those board meetings and nobody wants to be at those. That doesn't mean that people don't have valid opinions and that you shouldn't hear them out. But the public comment portion is really designed to allow the public to comment on proposed board action or matters that concern the board, right? So it's not designed to be an interactive back and forth type of situation. So a lot of boards will do, though, to address the concern that you brought up, which is not to sit there and make it sound like, and although this happens from time to time, you say thank you for your comment, and then everyone gets up and talks, and then you say thank you for your comment, and they feel like, well, I wasn't really heard. Many boards will have something where after the public comment portion is closed, they allow board member comments, right? And you might have like 5 minutes dedicated to board member comments. You might have none. There might be very few. Or you might have board member comments where you say, well, one of the gentlemen in the audience got up and spoke about this, and I think that that's a valid point and something that we should consider. so forth and so on. And I have seen it where the public comment does not sway the board's opinion because the board has put a lot of time and effort into making a decision about something, and the public is just bringing up things that the board has already considered at length, right? They've talked about it in committee meetings or wherever the case may be numerous times. But sure, sometimes someone might come and bring up an issue that maybe hasn't been fully addressed by a board. And sometimes it's appropriate to say, you know what, let's study that. I mean, I was at a board meeting where the question that came up was about having armed security officers in schools. That's a very divisive topic. There are some boards that of course we would have them, no brainer. Other boards who say, how can you even think about having such a thing? So community members came out, there were maybe 40 or 50, they gave a lot of opinions, and the appropriate thing to do at that point in time, the majority of the board felt was, let's table this, let's discuss it, let's have some investigation done, so forth and so on. We'll have a special ad hoc committee that's going to investigate it, and then we'll present our findings to the public 3 months from now, whatever the case may be. So so that's not to say that public comment isn't valuable, it is, but I think that rather engaging in that back and forth, which is necessarily going to, number one, delay the meeting, might prevent you from getting to your official business, but number two, we also want to make sure that we're treating everybody equally and we're not engaging with them or not engaging with them based upon the popularity of what it is that they have to say, right? So just like if you have time limits, I mean, often board policies will say, 3 minutes or 5 minutes. If it looks like it's going to take, if it looks like there's 10 people who want to speak, you can limit it to 3 minutes per person or 5 minutes per person. We've got to do that for everybody, right? The guy who comes up here and is saying all these positive things about the board and the great things that you're doing, you can't let him go for 10 minutes. And then the person who wants to criticize the board then say 3 minutes. Well, that's it. You got to go. So the same token, we wouldn't want to engage in a discussion with some people and then engage in no discussion with others. So my solution to that would be, everyone obviously is going to consider carefully the comments that the public makes, and then maybe after the public comments to have a board comment time period, a couple of minutes where board members can offer their comments about things that the public has said.
I think that's an excellent suggestion, that a board comment period after the public comment period, where there may be no comments.
Right.
But then it doesn't then involve a direct interaction between the board member and a member of the public, because then it could be at length. Every person may feel like they deserve an individualized response. It also gives the board members time to take it all in. After all the comments are given, we can hear everything. There may be no comments, or it may be that a comment, is given by a board member to say, after taking this new information and perspective that we may not have previously considered, this is now how I think that we may want to consider this going forward. And so I think that's an excellent suggestion.
Yeah, well, since I get to go to so many board meetings, I get to see examples of good board meetings and badly run board meetings. Thankfully, the latter is far less often. But any other questions? All right, great. Well, listen, it was great coming down here. For all those of you who are newly elected or got reelected, congratulations. Thank you for your public service on the Board of Education. Maybe next year they'll triple your salaries. I doubt it.
Well, I vote to triple their salary.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm all finished with the superintendent's report.
Okay. We are open to the public, limited to action items on the agenda.
Not hearing any. We had one correspondence since our last board meeting. Moving into the minutes, can I get a motion to adopt 2.01 to 2.02?
So moved.
Second.
Are there any questions or changes on the minutes? Not hearing any. Can I get a roll call, please?
Jared Beatrice,
Yes.
Ray Egbert,
Yes.
Carol Hampel,
Yes.
Rob McCallum,
Yes.
Andrew Saunders,
Yes.
Thomas Wallace,
Yes.
Eric Zorling,
Yes.
Anna Shin,
Yes.
Laura Simon.
Yes.
Passes.
Unfinished business. Does anybody have any unfinished business you want to bring up? Not hearing any new business from the board?
I have some new business, which is I have about 15 calendars that were given to me by various groups soliciting funding from me. And so if anybody wants a calendar for any reason, if they don't, then please put it in the break room for the teachers to enjoy.
Thank you. Sweet. Any other new business from the board? Not hearing any. We're open to the public. Anything on or off the agenda? Okay. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second. Roll call, please.
Charles Beechers,
Yes.
Ray Egbert,
Yes.
Carol Hample,
Yes.
Rob McCallum,
Yes.
Andrew Saunders,
Yes.
Thomas Wallace,
Yes.
Eric Zorelli,
Yes.
Anna Shin,
Yes.
Laura Simon.
Yes. Thank you.
This is your username and password. That's one of the card. This is one, and future board meetings, you're not gonna have paper agendas. It's all on here. They do the private portion of the agenda. You have to do a log in remotely. Clarify. Your username at Reddit and baseball.nj.us. So,
I just got my Sierra Club calendar yesterday.
and that's your password. So that way you can log in and do everything. Try it out.
People said
If
stuff
you're having
like
trouble accessing,
giant.
or navigating,